Today is July 31st, 2023. I want to talk about the conflict in Ukraine. I want to talk about the ongoing Ukrainian offensive. I want to start by taking a look at liveuamap.com. It is a live map, pro-Ukrainian, so please keep that in mind when we look at it. But even this pro-Ukrainian map shows the line of contact virtually unchanged after now nearly 2 months of offensive operations. Now, there's one area here where they are claiming Russia has lost control over Robotny, but this is not true. This is not verified. Even Western sources are not reporting on this, and that's why I warn people that this is a pro-Ukrainian map. It will post any change, verified or not, in favor of Ukraine, and it'll take weeks or longer to post anything that develops that is not in Ukraine's favor. The situation in the east, Ukraine continues to make small gains around Bakhmut. But a point I want to make here is that Bakhmut and the areas around it are very similar to these areas in the south. These are security zones ahead of what are layered Russian defenses. Ukraine has not reached the layered defenses in the south yet, and they would have to take all of Bakhmut to actually reach the first of several layers of defenses that that Russia has prepared since last year between Bakhmut and Popasnia. And I want to show you this map. This map is from this New York Times article from December 2022, Defenses Carved into the Earth. And they're talking about these defenses, layered defenses that Russia has created ahead of Ukraine's offensive. They started this over half a year ago. They have layered defenses in Zaporozhye and Kherson. They also have layered defenses between Bakhmut and Popasnia. They show these defenses: dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, trenches, pillboxes, and they have the maps of the defenses as of December 2022. They are much more extensive by now. Ukraine is to the west of Bakhmut right now. This is the eastern edge of Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces would have to take Bakhmut or go around the city just to reach the first of several layered Russian defenses. So even if they were to take Bakhmut as part of this offensive, it will be only the beginning of breaching Russian defenses in the east. Very important to keep that in mind. Now, let's talk about Ukraine's offensive. At the 2-month mark, we see another major push, which began about 5 days ago as of this recording. I want to show you this New York Times article from July 26th. It says, main thrust of Ukraine's offensive may be underway, U.S. officials say. After holding back many of its units trained and armed by the West, Ukraine is now committing them, the officials said, but it remained unclear whether a full-scale assault was taking place. And of course, they say that to hedge their claims against the possibility that this major thrust will fail. And the article says, this is the big test. One senior official said, administration officials and analysts said it might be only a matter of days to assess whether the attacks might be successful. It'll be clear soon whether this attack will allow Ukraine to change the current dynamic, said Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Well, now it has been several days, and what we have seen is no breakthrough and catastrophic losses by Ukraine. And after this New York Times article was published on July 26th, another one was published the day after, and it says, Ukraine pushes south but faces obstacles to counter-offensive. So the very next day, it was apparent that this offensive was not going well. They were suffering the same sort of losses they suffered in early June when they first launched their offensive. It says, a day after U.S. officials said the Ukraine had begun the main thrust of its counteroffensive, Kiev said it was pushing on 2 fronts. As President Vladimir Putin of Russia said, fighting had intensified. So everyone agrees the main thrust has begun. But the execution has proved difficult. Ukraine's forces must punch through dense minefields, tank traps, and other obstacles under withering air assaults and artillery bombardments across multiple Russian defensive lines and then pushed some 60 miles to the sea. It's important to understand what this means. They're saying that the offensive, the big push has begun, but they face all of these major obstacles, dense minefields, tank traps, other obstacles, and they're under withering air assaults and artillery bombardments. But you may have remembered this article here. This was from even earlier on. New York Times again. After suffering heavy losses, Ukrainians pause to rethink strategy. They admit that Ukraine has lost as much as 20% of its weapons and armor. And this is July 15th. And the article says Ukraine changed tactics, focusing more on wearing down the Russian forces with artillery and long-range missiles than charging into enemy minefields and fire. It's very important to understand what this all means, how the Ukrainian offensive has actually unfolded since the beginning of June when it started. They attempted at the very beginning to immediately break through Russian defenses. They had their armor supported by what they had left of their artillery, and they attempted to rush in, panic the Russian forces, and force them to flee. And they were hoping to recreate a situation similar to what unfolded in the fall in Kharkov, although the likelihood of that was very low, since in Kharkov, Russia had hardly any forces at all defending the area. In Zaporozhye, they have huge numbers of Russian forces defending the area, and they're organized in sufficiently prepared layered defenses. They were also trying to emulate NATO-style maneuver warfare, similar to what the US executed during Desert Storm in the 1990s in Iraq. They breached minefields and rushed through Iraqi defenses, decimating Iraqi forces. The idea that they were going to replicate this in Ukraine was extremely flawed, however. In Desert Storm, the US had a huge advantage in air power, long-range artillery, rockets, and missile systems. Ukraine does not. In order for them to have breached these minefields successfully in early June, they would have had to wipe out Russian forces that were in range and could fire upon their engineering teams as they cleared those minefields. They were unable to do that. They don't have air power. They have an insufficient amount of artillery to do that. That is why they launched the assault all at the same time. Artillery, armor, everything, all at one time. When it failed, they had no choice but to attempt to work on the defenses using long-range weapons, or they would have exhausted their entire force. Clearly, that did not work. The New York Times is admitting it's not working. They attempted the second big push, and they're still being faced by sufficient artillery and other weapons to stop them. I want to talk a little bit about this myth of Ukraine's artillery advantage. I've heard this from several Western analysts, including Michael Kaufman, who was referenced in this one New York Times article. I want to talk about the myth of Ukraine's supposed artillery advantage. And I want to expose this myth as yet further flawed thinking, similar to the thinking about NATO tanks and how great they were and how they would have enabled Ukraine to cut through Russian defenses, when clearly we knew that was not going to happen. We said it was not going to happen, and very clearly it did not happen. So let's figure out where this myth of Ukraine's artillery advantage came from, and why, after enjoying this advantage, when they launched their second big thrust just a week ago it still failed. Let's find out why. There's this article here from Forbes. This is from July 11th. Ukraine is winning the artillery war by destroying 4 Russian howitzers for every howitzer it loses. The article claims 17 months into Russia's wider war on Ukraine and a month into Ukraine's long-anticipated southern counteroffensive, Ukrainian forces are winning a key battle, the counter-battery battle. That is, the artillery-on-artillery fight that often determines which army prevails on a battlefield. And if that was true back in July 11th, then this big push would have went much differently, wouldn't it have? Where's Forbes getting this information about Ukraine destroying 4 Russian artillery pieces for every one that it loses. They're getting it from a site called Oryx. I've talked about Oryx before. It masquerades as some sort of open source intelligence resource. In reality, it is just war propaganda. It is the same war propaganda outlet that claimed Russia had lost 2,000 tanks and Ukraine 500 tanks. And this is the information that many analysts in the West use to draw conclusions that when NATO main battle tanks, modern main battle tanks, cut through Russian defenses, they would only have to defeat rusty T-55s. And that turned out to not be true, because Oryx is war propaganda, not actual intel. Oryx, regarding artillery losses, claims that Russia has lost 600 artillery pieces and Ukraine has only lost 200. Again, utterly absurd, utter war propaganda, and people using those numbers to then draw conclusions about the artillery aspects of the ongoing fighting. They are always going to draw the wrong conclusions. The Forbes article then says, huge consignments of Western-made systems, which often are more reliable and more accurate and further firing than Soviet-style systems. This is what they're claiming gives Ukraine the advantage. It also says, perhaps most importantly, Ukrainians have received from Germany, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States scores of counter-battery artillery radars that spot incoming artillery shells and rockets, pinpoint the source, and cue friendly howitzers and launchers to fire back. The radars, working in conjunction with small drones, make it very dangerous for Russian gunners to do their work. They have to shoot, then scoot fast to have any chance of surviving Ukrainian counter-battery radar, counter-battery fire. The Russians have their own radars and drones too, of course, but they obviously are less effective. It's so obvious that Forbes didn't even bother explaining how or produce any evidence to substantiate that claim. And in reality, that is not true. Russia at least has as good counter-battery capabilities as Ukraine, plus they enjoy an advantage of having many more radars, many more guns, and much more artillery ammunition. So obviously, Ukraine was not in any position to enjoy an artillery advantage. It's Western sources that admit that Ukraine is running low on artillery pieces and that the West has only a small number that they can send. They have been emptying their inventories. The UK, France, have emptied their inventories of self-propelled guns to give to Ukraine. 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, we know that is running low. The Western media has talked about this for months. Between the US and Europe, they don't make anywhere near enough ammunition to sustain Ukraine's current rate of fire, which is still lower than Russia's rate of fire. We know that Ukraine is running out of artillery shells. Before the offensive began and now during the offensive, this is the whole reason Ukraine was unable to soften up Russian defenses first and then attempt to breach their defenses. That is how it should have went, and it didn't. The reason it didn't is because they didn't have nearly enough artillery ammunition to weaken their defenses first and then support assault troops as they moved forward. They did not have enough. They had to do it all at the same time. And because they are so low on ammunition, we just watched the United States transfer 155 millimeter cluster munitions to make up for the fact that they are out of the high explosive rounds that they need to continue the offensive. Sending the cluster munitions are obviously not going to give Ukraine any sort of special advantage on the battlefield. It's simply to give them more artillery fire to stretch out their artillery capabilities for as long as possible. Now, in terms of counter-battery radars, yes, Ukraine was receiving counter-battery radar systems from the West. And I had covered for many months the transfer of these counter-battery radar systems to Ukraine as part of these Pentagon military assistance packages. They were drawing them from US inventories for several months, and then they ran out of them. They need to maintain a certain number of counter-battery radar systems for US troops. They are no longer able to send Ukraine any more on hand. What did they begin doing? Drawing up contracts with a company in Buffalo, New York that makes these counter-battery radar systems. They drew up these contracts, and now they're waiting for these to be manufactured. There's not enough people to expand production. It takes 6 months to a year to build these in very small batches, and it'll take years to actually fulfill the orders the Pentagon has put in to supply Ukraine with replacements. Russia is removing counter-battery radar systems from Ukraine's inventory on the battlefield faster than the United States and its allies can replace them. That is a fact. And we've watched that unfold during these Pentagon press releases regarding these aid packages. What is most likely happening that has given rise to this myth of a Ukrainian artillery advantage is the fact that Ukraine is taking whatever it has left of its artillery, of its counter-battery capabilities, and concentrating them in just a few places along the line of contact, depriving other areas of the battlefield of sufficient artillery support, and they are gaining a local advantage temporarily over the Russian artillery in that same area. And it is temporary because as soon as Russia realizes they're outgunned, they bring in reserves, and it tilts the balance back in Russia's favor. That's why we see these gains made by Ukraine, and then these gains reversed by Russia once the reserves show up. This is unsustainable for Ukraine. They are losing artillery pieces. They're running out of ammunition every single day this offensive continues. And every single day that they don't break through, they have less artillery to support their forces when they finally do break through. And this has been the problem identified long before it ever began in early June. This is what people said was going to happen, and it's exactly what's happening. Russia is going to be able to weather all of this. This is a war of attrition, and Russia is positioned to win this war of attrition. Ukraine is spending its men and its equipment for territory in a war of attrition. That is not how you move yourself toward victory. That is how you move yourself one step closer to defeat. And now we want to talk about sustaining this offensive, and we can see how desperate the West has become. So let's take a look at this announcement from Politico. U.S. expects to begin delivering Abrams tanks to Ukraine in September. It says the plan is to send a handful of Abrams to Germany in August, where they will undergo final refurbishments. Once that process is complete, the first batch of Abrams will be shipped to Ukraine the following month, so September. The potential August and September deliveries mark the most specific time frame provided for when America's main battle tank is expected to roll onto the battlefield. Pentagon officials have previously said the Abrams would be in Ukrainian hands sometime in the fall. The U.S. is sending older M1 A1 models instead of the more modern A2 version, which would have taken a year to get to Ukraine. And that was because they had to manufacture them from scratch, and it would be an export version of the M1 A2. The article also talks about how Ukrainians are undergoing a 10-week training course to operate the M1 Abrams. And I've talked about this at length. If you're an entry-level tanker, you will spend 6 months at a minimum learning how to operate the M1 Abrams. Then you go to your unit and you need to train even more to learn how to be an efficient member of a tank crew. And then you need to train with other tanks to be efficient at fighting as a platoon, as a company, as a battalion, and then as a brigade. And then, of course, in terms of fighting combined arms warfare, 10 weeks is not nearly enough to achieve all of that. It will not be achieved. These M1 Abrams will roll onto the battlefield in the same condition as the German Leopard 2 tanks did, and they will end up burning in heaps just like the Leopard 2 tanks have. The Politico article says the arrival of the tanks in the coming weeks will add a new lethal dimension to Ukraine's inventory as its forces struggle to break through entrenched Russian defenses along a front line that stretches for hundreds of miles. No, they will not. We see the Politico article still trying to sell this idea that some sort of wonder weapon can turn the tide on the battlefield for Ukraine. It cannot, just like the German Leopard 2 could not. We watched the German Leopard 2 tank in northern Syria used by Turkish forces who had plenty of time to learn how to operate them effectively, both as a tank and as part of combined arms operations. and they still burned in large numbers in northern Syria, defeated by irregular forces with far fewer resources than Russian forces in Ukraine. M1 Abrams, and actually a much newer version, the M1A2S, it's a version specifically made for Saudi Arabia. These were being used in Yemen, and they also suffered losses. And we know that because there were articles like this from Defense One from 2016. Saudi losses in Yemen war exposed by US tank deal. And the article says, turns out 20 of those tanks made in America by General Dynamics Land Systems are battle damage replacements for Saudi tanks lost in combat. Even though the formal announcement of the sale does not say where the tanks were fighting, the Saudi military is believed to have lost some of its 400 plus Abrams tanks in Yemen, where it is fighting Iranian-backed Houthi separatists. They are going to fare no better than German Leopard 2s did in Ukraine. That is a fact. There's nothing special about an M1A1 crewed by inexperienced Ukrainians that is going to do anything different than the Leopard 2s did, which was hit mines, take hits from anti-tank guided missiles fired by infantry, fired by attack helicopters, take a hit by artillery, and then burn on the battlefield. That is what the M1 Abrams is going to do if and when it reaches the battlefield in Ukraine. I want to talk about this article from the Telegraph. I heard Alexander Mikuris of the Duran talking about this. I highly recommend the Duran. If you're not following them, please do. They put out daily reports on Ukraine. Alexander talked about this. I want to talk about this also. Ukraine, the latest leaked German report on counteroffensive, extremely unhelpful. And this is a report from the German army about the counteroffensive, how it's failing, and how it's not NATO's fault, it's Ukraine's fault. And the article says, Ukraine's counteroffensive is failing to make progress because its army is not fully implementing the training it has received from the West. Kiev is spreading its troops out too thinly across the 1,000-kilometer front line and attacking in units composed of too few soldiers. It goes on and it says, Ukrainian soldiers trained by the West are showing great learning success, but they are let down by commanders who have not been through the boot camps. Ukraine is sacrificing its advantage in manpower by attacking in units of between 10 and 30 men, insufficient to break through Russian lines. There's a couple of points to make here. First of all, not fully implementing the training received from the West. Ukraine is trying to cross extensive minefields protected by huge amounts of long-range Russian firepower. Are we to believe that NATO actually trained them to be able to do this without air power, without sufficient artillery support? And they're simply not implementing the training. When was the last time NATO ever conducted an operation of this kind? The answer is never. They would never attempt to conduct an operation of this kind. So this right here is simply NATO having categorically failed these Ukrainians that they trained. They did not give them the training they needed to succeed, because there is no way for them to succeed, because they were not given the military equipment needed to succeed. The article also says, it adds that the small unit sizes increase the risk of friendly fire and fail to group together enough Western-trained soldiers to be operationally effective. The report claimed that Western-trained soldiers understood the operational principles of fire and movement, but when they returned to Ukraine, they would often be commanded by officers who used different military tactics. And Ukraine is operating in much smaller units, because there was not enough time to train much larger units to effectively carry out maneuver warfare the way NATO would have wanted to train them to do. It takes months for infantrymen to learn how to operate as a fire team, as a squad, as a platoon, and as a company, and then it takes even longer to operate as, say, a brigade. That takes a very long time. It takes a very long time to build up a brand new brigade and have it operate effectively on the battlefield as a brigade. That could take over a year to do, and Ukraine simply doesn't have this time. It also says German military leaders also expressed frustration at experienced fighters being promoted over Western-trained troops, with the report claiming combat experience does not mean that the soldier is a good leader in combat. The compressed, abbreviated training NATO gave these conscripts was not even enough to bring them up to the standards of a basic infantryman in, say, the US Army or the US Marine Corps. And yet they think that these barely trained conscripts should have been leading troop formations. It takes years to produce an officer. It takes years to produce an NCO or a senior NCO, non-commissioned officer. This simply is impossible to do in such a short period of time. It is impossible to do. The German report is talking about how impossible it is to build these brigades out of scratch, that it's not working. You can't just train them in 3 months and throw them into battle. What the German report's doing, though, is blaming the Ukrainians and not blaming how unrealistic this entire NATO training program was to begin with. So that's where we are, 2 months into the offensive. Everything that analysts objectively looking at all of this have said over the last 6 months to a year about the problems Ukraine has in terms of artillery pieces and ammunition, the lack of trained manpower, the inability for NATO to raise brigades out of thin air. All of this is now being demonstrated on the battlefield amid this offensive. There was the first push in June, early June, which failed. There was an attempt to use it used everything, armor and artillery, to try to punch through in the first 24 to 48 hours, maybe the first week, and it failed. They took what artillery they had left and they attempted to wear down Russian defenses and try again. They received these cluster munitions to help extend their artillery capabilities for a little bit longer. This big push has failed, and now we have to wait and see what happens next. I want to remind people, finally, that Russia has created these defenses in layers for a reason. If Ukraine is actually able to put together a large enough assault that would cause significant Russian losses or potentially cut off or encircle Russian units, Russia will fall back to the next line of defenses. The whole purpose of this is to absorb Ukraine's offensive, diminish its offensive potential while maintaining the men and machines of the Russian military, so that when Ukraine's offensive does stop on the map, wherever it stops, it will be fully exhausted, while Russia will have the ability to then counterattack, take back this territory, and decimate what's left of Ukrainian forces. I will keep an eye on this offensive. If there are any major developments, I will do another update. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Also in the video description below are all of the links that I referenced while doing this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad for some reason pops up anyway, please feel free to skip it. It's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help out, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing this work with others, all of that is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.